everyone, Bo Pearson here with Volt, joined by Coach Lew Porchiazzo from University of Michigan. Lew, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. We're going to talk a little bit about return to play, and especially given the current circumstances, returning from COVID-19. There are some similarities, when we think about what we might normally do after like a summer break, but obviously also some special considerations given the amount of time that a lot of athletes have been taking off. So really glad to have you kind of provide some insight, maybe some guidance for some of our strength coaches, sport coaches, or athletes who might follow all of Volt and look to Volt for some guidance. Real quick, I got to make sure I give you a justified introduction. So I've got some notes here so I don't butcher it. But for everybody who's just joining in and might not know Lew, Lew's joining us with over 10 years of strength conditioning experience. Again, University of Michigan, head strength conditioning coach, a head strength conditioning coach there, working with softball, women's gymnastics, and men's soccer primarily. While at Michigan, Lew has been the strength conditioning coach for 22 Big Ten championships.
Yep. And
championship teams. And prior to joining Michigan, Lew spent time at Baylor and at the Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs. And just like today, Lew makes a really intentional point to give back to the strength and conditioning community. So presenting at local and national conferences, that's actually where you and I met for the first time, was at an NSCA national conference, and doing talks like this. So again, Lew, thanks for sharing.
Yeah, no problem. I'm happy to be here and share with you from about 2,000 miles away.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into my first question that I had for you. Obviously, we had some time to kind of debrief and go over this before we recorded our conversation. But the point that we've been trying to emphasize and the information we've been trying to put out for our coaches is that return to play, and especially this upcoming school year, is so much more than just the social distancing and the cleaning protocols and keeping athletes safe. It extends, that stuff is important, but it extends outside of just those COVID-19 specific topics. And so what I'd really like to get into today is what are those other factors to kind of keep in mind? Coming from a strength conditioning background, what are those other factors to keep in mind as athletes ramp back up with practices and competitions this summer or after this summer?
Yeah, so I think, every situation is a little bit different, but I think it's fair to say that our student athletes have had extended time off. So when you look at extended time off, maybe it's 10 weeks, maybe it's 12 or 14, wherever the case is. It's hard to argue the statement of extended time off. So for us at Michigan in the collegiate setting and even at the high school and the club setting, you see that there are voluntary periods where they're isolated, likely and often with limited equipment availability, and just not in an atmosphere that's conducive for training for sport. And that's the reality of the matter and the fact of the situation. So in the event that somebody was in a really great situation and they have a great home gym set up, or they have access to some equipment, and we're able to continue training with little interruption over a break, over this extended break, that's great. But really, I think we need to look at that as kind of the exception rather than the rule. So in all reality, there's a chance that many of our student athletes are coming back in a detrained state to some extent, and we need to prepare and anticipate for that. So I think in anticipation of the fact that their training has been interrupted and significantly modified from what we would typically do during this portion of the year, I think it's important to account for the fact that they're just potentially not as physically prepared, and to start prescribing volumes and intensities with that in mind. So I think for us, as we look at Michigan and the return to play and return to participation protocol that we've come up with, we'll start at 50% total volume range. So what I'll do is once we actually determine the specific exact return date, which we're pretty close to releasing that information and kind of moving forward with that process, I'll look back at the equivalent time last year. I'll get an idea of what their volume looked like, and I'll prescribe a week. The second week back, I'll probably up that volume 70 to 75% range, about 10%, 10 to 15% higher that third week. So pretty close to normal. And by week 4, assuming that they've trained consistently and had few hiccups along the way, we'll be back to a volume that we would typically expect for this time of year. So it's a steady and incremental approach. I'd rather be blown away with how strong they are, how fit they are, how generally well prepared they are, and have to hit the brakes and tell them that we're done for the day, then try to push the gas and try to get more out of them than maybe they're actually able to give us right now. So I think it's really important to take a conservative approach and to increase incrementally to try and catch the bulk majority of the group that likely was in a pretty modified and restricted training environment.
Yeah. You were cutting out there for a second, but you were kind of talking about in the initial weeks, you're going to reduce volume. Did you say, how much do you say you're going to be reducing volume?
Yeah. So initially that first week back will be somewhere around 50%, maybe a tick higher of the total volume that we were at the equivalent time of the off season last year. So for my sports, I'll say softball and women's gymnastics, who are pretty far from their competition season, they're just in the start of their off season in this June, July, August time. So I would anticipate somewhere in that 50 to 55% range of total volume, and then increasing it anywhere in the range from 10 to 25% weekly until we reach week 4, about what would typically be our 100% of volume.
Yeah, and then those sports like women's soccer, those sports who have less of a run-up time, does that make things a little bit more tricky?
Yeah, it does. You know, it's what's interesting about the fall sports is that they're typically in a setting where, with the exception of football, so on the Olympic sports side, our fall sports don't have required an extended period of required training leading up to their return to campus and ultimately their first competition. So generally speaking, I'll take men's soccer as an example, but the same is true for women's soccer, field hockey, and volleyball here. A lot of those other fall sports, they'll return to campus typically somewhere around August 10th, and by the end of August, they're playing full matches. So within 3 weeks, they're expected to show up, arrive on campus, and then be competing, having had, at the minimum for us, 12 weeks of voluntary training leading up to that, where many of them return home. They may take classes online or in person. They may be training with a club team. So those are other factors to consider as well. The fact that most of the country has been in a restricted setting where our student athletes like soccer that may go home and play with their club teams lose that training environment as well. So they lose the technical development that comes from that, along with that game fitness that's hard to replicate in just a fitness program or a summer training packet. So I think as you look to ramp up those fall sports, it looks the same from a ramp up standpoint. Maybe not necessarily from a strength training standpoint specifically, because the emphasis needs to be so heavily placed on time on the court or on the field, wherever their actual field of play is. But that's where I think the relationship with sport coaches and the conversation with sport coaches really goes a long way in helping to set them up for success in the long term. So those are conversations that relate to practice volume, high-speed distance volume, what practice structure might look like. And I don't pretend to be an expert in soccer or any other sport. I'm an expert in my area, but I think that our lanes intersect. So sure. I try to ride in my lane as much as I can, but I understand that I need to be able to bob and weave in and out of my lane to assist the lanes around me, the sport coaches, the athletic trainers, the dietitians, and everyone that has their own lane. We all need to be able to intersect and understand where our lanes do, and then return back to our lane when time comes. So it's an analogy I've used a lot over time, and I think I fall back on the experts in their area to really hammer home the details of what a practice structure looks like, taking input from myself, from our athletic trainer, and from everyone else that has a hand in the program. Yeah,
that's so good. And you know, a lot of Volt coaches might not necessarily have all of those structures around them. But even if that's the case, what it says is that you should be thinking, it's still your responsibility to think about the whole picture, right? Not just worrying about what you're doing in the weight room, not only worrying about your practice or your conditioning, right? It all plays a role. It's all stress or workload that's going to be put on the athlete, right?
I think every situation, you're right, at the high school level or in different institutions or organizations, we're fortunate at Michigan to have the staff we do. So there are different lanes, and there's typically somebody riding in each of those lanes. If you're in a situation where you still have all those lanes and those areas and factors to consider, and you're the only person or one of a few people, maybe two people across those 5 or 6 lanes, well, you need to cover all of them in some fashion. So it's a little bit trickier, but I think there's some great resources out there, and I try to be one myself for coaches that are in a position that have limited resources or have some restrictions on what they have available to them.
Yeah. That kind of carries into my next question when we talk about collaborating with other experts. When it comes specifically to the cleaning and the screening and the distancing and everything like that, obviously local areas are going to have different restrictions depending on where you are, right? But from a coaching standpoint, from somebody who's in charge of running a weight room or in charge of facilitating groups in a space, what are some of those best practices, or what are some suggestions you might make when it comes to screening and distancing athletes when they return to campus?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's kind of a multi-pronged approach, and it's important to look at your local area. So for us, Darryl Conway has been tremendous as kind of the point person in athletics for us in working with our hospital, with the institution as a whole, with our county health department, and so on. So he is that main hub or focal point that really gathers information from all these different areas and then disseminates it to us as a staff. Anything that's pertinent to strength and conditioning comes to us and overlaps with athletic training and so on. So I think having somebody that's an identified point person or hub to gather and disseminate information is important. At different levels, that might look different. It might be an athletic trainer, it could be a superintendent or principal or an athletic director or what have you. But somebody that's that main point of contact initially. I think from there, making sure the information's pulled from the right areas. And like I mentioned, it's the county health department, it's your local hospital system, it's any healthcare professionals that are part of your system, your organization, or your district. It's tapping into the CDC as a great source for resources, whether it be signage or verbiage or some just general guidelines. And I think for us, really hammering home the importance of student athletes taking ownership of this and recognizing the seriousness behind why the country has shut down for as long as it have, and why sports have seemingly disappeared for 3 months. I think as we look forward towards the fall season and really sports starting up again, it's on all of us within athletics to do everything that we do as effectively as possible and as with as much purpose and intent as possible. And whether that's wearing a mask and wearing it correctly, whether that's demanding and creating the culture of expectation that you create the proper social distancing, especially in times when it's not required. So whether it's heading in the locker room or the training room, whether it's after practice on the field near the water station, or whatever guidelines and stipulations you come up with, I think enforcing the rules that you create based on your individual situation and the resources that you have access to. So again, to talk about what we do, we'll do daily questionnaires, and that's something that our IT department has worked through. And the questionnaire will be simple. Essentially, it's a symptom check. Do you have a list of any of the symptoms that are related to COVID? And if you do, obviously that red flags that individual, and I think the ultimate decision will be to stay home that day and potentially monitor that person and isolate until we can come up with a better solution and a plan moving forward. I think it's in athletics, we want to persevere. We want to push hard. We want to push the limits of what we're capable as humans in a lot of ways. You think about Michael
Kind of our
Jordan.
job.
Yeah, right. It is. So it's a different mindset in the foreseeable future to, if you don't feel well, to stay home and to be okay with that, and don't try not to be a superhero right now in that sense. Do everything you can, but if you're sick, your superhero job is to stay home and make sure that you're not ill and not putting others at risk. And that's something that we've taken seriously as a staff, and our student athletes will take serious. And I encourage everyone to do so for the sake of having sport. And for the athletes that are participating in them.
Yeah. You bring up a lot of really good points there. Number one being, I think, practically speaking, when it comes to getting the right information, putting somebody in charge and having somebody own that role is really important. And then disseminating that information down all the way from the administration to the coaches, all the way down to the athletes. Because just like with anything, if the athletes don't believe in it, it's a lot less likely to happen.
Yeah.
I think those are really good points. Okay, returning back to the sport performance side for kind of my last question here. Talk a little bit about coordinating with sport coaches, understanding that strength and conditioning, practice, technical, tactical, sport, practice, and competitions all play a role in the big picture, right? They all need to be managed and viewed together. If you are a strength coach or a sport coach that didn't have your stuff documented last year, so you talked about reducing volume as compared to a similar time last year. If you don't have that, maybe now you start collecting that and keeping track of it. But if you don't have that, how do you suggest navigating? What does 50% look like? What does 75% look like? How do you kind of pull back from there?
Sure. Yeah, I think it takes a little bit of creativity, and I think you bring up a good point. If you haven't documented previously, it's a good chance to start something new. But I think a simple way to do it is to look at the total time, at least initially. Start from a time standpoint. So if you have a pretty good grasp on the fact that your training sessions are always 2.5 hours, and you can account for the fact that a warm-up and a cool-down session make up 20 minutes total of those 2.5 hours, that leaves you with 2 hours and 10 minutes of typical training time. So I look at that information and say, okay, well, half of that is an hour and 5 minutes. So in that hour and 5 minutes, I'm essentially going to reduce my practice session to that, say, hour and 5 minute total time frame. And maybe it's not necessarily exactly half, and it's more like 60%, but you do factor in extra time for rest periods, for hammering home hydration and pushing that. Maybe there's more of a piece focused on a classroom portion where you can pull out the whiteboard and go through some of the mental side of the sport. But I think if you don't have that information available to you, as far as what you specifically did previously in years prior, or you're a new coach to a new team, but you do have an idea what your typical practice structure looks like, take that total time and reduce it. And that could be looking at the practice duration as a whole, could be looking at different segments of practice and reducing it by a certain amount of time, but still allowing for appropriate rest time. So if I reduce the session from 20 minutes to 10 minutes, and in that 20 minutes, I normally have 2 minutes of water time. That doesn't mean eliminating water. It means you're just reducing that time to accommodate the fact that student athletes are coming from a period of pretty significant detraining. Not to mention the fact that there's just a heightened state of awareness and stimulus that they're not accustomed to. I think certainly coaches will feel pressure, and student athletes will feel the pressure to properly social distance, to make sure that they're not sharing water bottles, to make sure that they're doing everything the right way. There's just going to be new rules in place as we enter this new normal. So it's difficult to account for the fact that we need to get accustomed to it, and it takes time and energy away from whatever it is you're doing physically to account for all of those other areas that are just different. So it's difficult to anticipate, but I think time is a great way to start, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and that's a really practical way to at least get started, like you said. Awesome, Lou. Thanks so much for sharing. There's so many other topics that we could cover, but I think you delivered some awesome takeaways. Hopefully that coaches can really learn from and try out for themselves. I mean, all of this really is uncharted territory for everyone. So it's as many ideas we can get out there from people with expertise in the field, to allow coaches and athletes to try new things, maybe get closer to what might be ideal. And if they have any questions, absolutely, for anybody who's watching this, if you have any questions, please reach out to us. We're happy to help out and answer and provide some guidance however we can. Lou, thanks again for joining us. Always appreciate it.
Thanks, Bo. I appreciate it. It's always impactful and an area for me that I try to help others and help move the profession forward. And we're all in it for the same reason. We're in it for the athletes, and we're in it for their ability to go out and compete and compete for championships and to be part of something bigger than themselves. And we're a piece of that puzzle. So whatever I can do to help athletics as a whole move forward, I'm going to try to continue to do that.
Awesome. All right. We'll talk to you again soon. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Bo. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.